So we're looking at Learning Outcome 2 for assessing learners in education and training. Now, this learning outcome, again, is got a few assessment criteria. So I'll just go through what we're looking at today. So Learning Outcome 2 is to be able to carry out assessments in accordance with internal and external requirements. So internal, external, like internal is your school's requirements, external would be like the awarding bodies, the national curriculum and so on. So we've got 2.1, which is to identify the internal and external assessment requirements and related procedures of learning programs. 2.2, use assessment types and methods to enable learners to produce assessment evidence that is valid, reliable, sufficient, authentic, and current. 2.3 is to conduct assessments in line with internal and external requirements. 2.4, record the outcomes of assessments to meet internal and external requirements. And finally, 2.5, communicate assessment information to other professionals with an interest in learner achievement. Yeah, I've got an echo. Have you? Yeah, there. You've fixed that, I think. So let's make a start. So 2.1. So is to identify the internal and external assessment requirements and related procedures of learning programs. So when we're making assessments, it's just about us making a judgment about the work that our students have done. So an assessment doesn't have to be something formal or even based off formal work. It can be something that you're doing on a daily basis. You might have a student with you that you're working with and you're looking at how they're working, what sort of steps they're taking, if the knowledge is being embedded, and then you might go ahead and you're assessing them, and then you're making a judgment as to, are they okay to continue with this course of study? You need to simplify it. Can you put them into a higher group? So you're carrying out assessments on a daily basis, to be honest. But when you're doing that, you need to make sure that you're following the 5 principles of assessment. And this is denoted as VACSA. Now, there'll be quite a few variations with this, but the main part is just VACSA. So VACSR, it just covers valid, authentic, current, sufficient, and reliable. So you've got to see, is the work valid? Is it authentic? Is it current? So is it work that they've done now? So, for example, if you were judging an adult student's piece of work, or was it done 3-4 years ago? Is it still valid and current for that period of study? Is it sufficient? And again, is it reliable? So when we're looking at assessments, we do internal assessments also. So an internal assessment approach is what we use for a majority of our course of studies and a majority of the qualifications that we're doing. So we look at these methods of assessment to just see how the students are, producing their evidence. So for me, when I'm looking at your work, I would look at, you follow the assessor's guide? I'd follow the qualifying body's requirements, but then I'll also make sure that the work that you're producing, is it following our internal requirements? Is it following the work that I've set for you? Have you covered those points? Do you have a portfolio of evidence which reflects what we've been learning about? Now, we do this in a lot of different ways, so there's a few different methods of assessment that can be used. And these are actually just set out within your unit, it's within your qualification. Like when you get the spec sheets or you'll get your assignment brief for the courses of studies. It just lays out exactly how you're meant to be doing your work. The specification sheet will tell you what assessment criteria you're looking at. In different courses that you've, on this one it's not eligible, but on different courses we have something called an assignment brief, where they'll tell you, are you making a PowerPoint? Are you making a leaflet? So there's quite a few different varieties available. So for assessment methodology over here, got internally set and internally marked work. So things that I try to focus this on a school environment for some of these, because I know that that's where you're based. So you look at things like spelling tests that you've set, comprehension tests, quizzes, conversations, having dialogues, doing your homework. So there, you set them internally and you mark them internally. So you're doing them within your setting. Externally set and externally marked assessments are things like end of term tests. So you in school with the older students, I think from year 3 upwards, you get spring, autumn and summer assessments where you actually assess their knowledge. You've got the SATs, you've got the year 1 phonics assessments, GCSEs, A-levels, any type of qualifications you're doing, even NCFE, RQF, any of those that are externally set and externally marked. Are you both okay with the assessment methodology, or do you want me to go over some points on here?
No, I'm fine with it.
Rex, are you okay on here?
Yeah, it's okay. Go ahead.
Brilliant. Let's go forward. So then we're going to look at quality assurance. So to make sure that we're actually doing assessments in a fair and reliable way, we need to cover quality assurance on here as well. So these assessment needs that you need to look at for each candidate, each student, they need to be properly identified. So they need to be making sure that you're actually working towards what your student is capable of and adapting them as well. So your centre's quality assurance or your school's quality assurance system need to include some processes. Like you need to identify candidates' assessment needs. So if a student has learning requirements, they've got dyslexia or dyscalculia, or maybe they've got other learning requirements that might require them to be liable for extra time, you need to ensure that they do get that 20 minutes extra. You apply for it and that they're able to get it. You need to determine the most appropriate assessment arrangement as well. Now, sometimes you'll get a range of students. Say if you're doing an apprenticeship with some students and you've got a whole variety of students, most of them are comfortable with, they're all comfortable with speaking English, but they're not all comfortable reading and writing English. So if you were to have one student that came up to you and said, I can speak in English, but this test that you're going to set for me is done, I have to read English and I have to write it as well. I'm not able to do that in my workplace. I can't, they don't require me to do any writing. I just do my work and I'm done. So what would you do for that student? So they can speak English, but they can't read it or write it. What would you do?
Can we provide it in different language? Or have some scriber who can translate and write?
Yes, that is an option, yep. What about, Rex, have you got any ideas of what you could do? Because they're correct as well.
Yeah, if a student can read English but cannot write.
Yeah, and then you can do it in, yeah, that's right. You can do it in different languages. You can provide a translator, or maybe you could just ask a simple way. Could be that if you can't access translators or you can't get someone to come in and go through the process, maybe you could, because the students' spoken English is fine, maybe you can just go ahead and do it orally as well. So that, and then record it and have that as an assessment procedure. So sometimes you have to think out of the box of how you can just make sure that you're meeting their needs. Going on to, you've got to verify the candidate's need for assessment arrangement. So you're looking at the appropriate assessment arrangement, but you've actually got to look at their need for that assessment arrangement. Is it necessary? Can they get around it? Can they do it the standard way that you've set, or do you have to change it for them? And then again, authorize the submission of a request for an assessment arrangement in an external exam. So saying that you've got a student that has learning, additional learning requirements, and they need an extra 20 minutes, they're eligible for an extra 20 minutes on their exam, you saying that and then just giving it to them It doesn't work that way. You've actually got to apply for that extra time. You've got to put it down, the evidence of why they need it, and then actually get it arranged externally and get permission for it. So there are a few things that you've got to do to make sure that you're following, dotting all your I's and crossing all your T's, make sure you're covering yourself completely. Now, on a normal basis, when you're working in your normal setting, a lot of these things will be taken care of for you. So your senior management will most likely have actually put those submissions and those requests in. But it's good to know in case you're in a position that you have to do it. You should also keep records of assessments, yeah?
Can I ask one thing?
Yeah?
No, we had 2 points. It says identify learner's need and identify candidate's assessment needs. Can they both be different?
Let me just see where. Yes, identify a candidate's assessment needs and identify the learner's needs. So the assessments are how you're actually going to carry out an assessment. So the learner's needs are how they're actually going to study. But the assessment is how are they going to show that they're actually going through that course of study, how they're gathering the evidence to say that they qualify. So, example, if someone's coming to do plumbing course, you know what their learning needs are. They need to, they might have dyslexia, you might need to adapt some things, you might need to do some coloured papers, you might need to break tasks down for them. So that's their learner's needs. But for their assessment needs, you need to actually show how can you adapt that assessment, that exam, that test to actually suit that learner. So they're quite similar, but one is just about how they're learning and one is about how you're assessing them.
Okay.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Aisha.
Yeah?
In a situation, can you go back to the slide?
Yes, of course. Yes.
We're talking about quality assurance now, like the scenario that you gave now. If in a situation, a learner knows how to read, but doesn't know how to write. So
what would you do in that? Yeah.
Yeah.
In that situation, you've got. Sorry, do you want to carry on?
What is the help needed in this place? Because you are giving like. If I'm assessing a learner now, he knows how to read, but I'm to submit a report about what he or she has written. So what can we do as an assessors? What can we do in this situation?
Okay. So if your learner knows how to read and they know how to speak fluently, if their English is good, then I would say that you get a scribe to come in. So if you're their teacher, you are not going to be their scribe. You get someone to come in externally who is qualified to be a scribe. Now, a scribe is a person who will just sit there and word for word write down what you say. So if you were being a scribe for me, Rex, I would read the questions myself. They would not get read for me. Then I would answer them verbally, and then you would just write down everything I say word for word. Whether it's right or wrong, the scribe's job is just there to dictate it on a piece of paper. So that is the one option to do. Another option to do is if you can't have access to a scribe, or if it's not possible to, if it's a last minute thing, to be honest, scribes normally you can get hold of quite easily. You would do an oral presentation where the student would read the question and then they would just speak and you would record them. So you have that assessment in a video or recording format. So there's two options that you can do. I would prefer the scribe in that situation though. Is that okay? So Rex, did you cut out? Are you still here? Geeta, can you still hear me?
Well, I'm here. I don't know about him.
I think Rex has cut out. I'll wait for him to come back in, and then we'll go back over that. Okay. So we'll just carry on while we're waiting. So we're going to be looking at keeping records of assessment now. So when you're doing, obviously because we're looking at assessment requirements on here, we need to make sure that we're recording. Oh, hi Rex, are you back?
Yeah, I'm back. I don't know. I was cut off.
So, did you hear what I was saying, or did you cut out in the middle of it?
I think I was cut off at the middle of it, so I didn't hear what you said.
So I was saying there's two things you can do. If your student can speak English and read English, but they can't write it, get them to have, you'd employ a scribe to come in. So a scribe is a person that will just sit down with the student in a nice quiet room. The student will read the questions themselves, then they will dictate the answer. So if you were scribing for me, I would read the question, I would say to you, Rex, this is what I'm going to answer. I would tell you what my answer is, and you write down what I say word for word. The second option is you can get it done orally. So you could record it using a dictaphone or a voice recording app, or even on like a Join Me like we do here. But the scribe is the better option.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So on to when we're doing assessments, it's very important that we keep records of assessments because we need to back ourselves up as well. So I found this on a daily basis is where I get asked by management, this student of yours has completed their course of study, what grade have they got, how long does it take, have you got their coursework? So I've got folders for each student with all their work in there. So keeping records is really important. Now, when you're keeping a record of your students' work, it also helps you to identify any strengths and weaknesses in their skills. So if you're in a school setting, for example, you'd be able to know that your students sometimes struggle with their grammar, maybe they struggle with their spelling, and so on. In an adult education sector, you'd be able to know what sort of feedback you're going to give them. I might say, on some assignments I've had grammatical errors that need to be fixed for your next assignment. Put in a contents page. Make sure your paragraphs are smaller. Put more detail in. So you've got all these things that you can actually help the student work on and tell them these are your strengths, but these are some areas of improvement that you need to work on and make your work a little bit more professional with. Then we're going into assessments. We're almost done with 2.1. So assessments are exam conditions. So on here, when you're doing assessments or you're doing exams, you need to make sure that your student is supervised. You might need to split it over multiple sessions. So depending on if you've got, if you think about the SATs papers in primary schools, you get 3 SATs papers. So if you were to give all 3 SATs papers at once on the same day for maths, it will be too much to go through. So you would need to actually split them over multiple sessions. I do apologize for the voices in the background. The children are home. They'll quieten down in a second. Then you might need a scribe, like we mentioned. You might need to do the assessment verbally, so where they're actually talking to you and you're recording their sessions. In any type of assessment or exam condition, you will need to have them be timed, and both of you will be familiar with this. Rex, when you're doing your sitting in on your English exams or your reading, speaking and listening ones, they're all time sessions. Geeta, when you're doing your phonics assessments, if you're doing the external ones, they'll be timed as well. Mm-hmm. And again, you might have extra time available in certain circumstances. Like, for example, if I came in and I had an exam next week, but I've come in and I've broken my right hand, that's my writing hand, I can't do it. So you might have to get a scribe to come in for me, but you might also have to allow me some extra time because I'm going to have to dictate what I'm saying, and maybe that scribe might take a few minutes extra writing it down, or you're repeating yourself a few times. Mm-hmm. You've also got to make sure that you follow requirements in accordance to your awarding bodies or to the national curriculum or to whatever curriculum that you're following within your organization. Now, when I'm doing this NCFE qualification with the both of you, when I'm marking your work, because this is not test-based, this is assessment-based, I've got to make sure that I'm marking the work in a certain way that actually reflects their requirements. If I'm not doing that, if I'm not doing my job properly, it might turn around that you, when it comes to getting it certified and you get it externally quality assured, then you might come up with points and say, right, no, actually, you've got to go back and you've got to do this, this, and this. You've got more on this work, and it creates a big headache. So assessors have to really be making sure that they're doing things in the requirements that are needing to be done. With these requirements, it might be your external requirements by the awarding bodies. It might be your employer's requirements. So when they might say to you on a normal basis, right, Etha, go ahead, you're going to do these assessments for me today. You might have a requirement where you have to take that child or that student into a separate area in a quiet place, for an intervention area where there's no one else there. You might have to sit in the back of the classroom, and if you've got no areas, and try and make sure everybody's quiet. So there's loads of different stipulations that you've got to follow. So are we okay with 2.1 before I go into the tips section?
What is that sector skill council?
Sector skills council are just things like, do you know when we talked about minimum course?
Yeah.
We call them sector skills sometimes. Basic skills, English skills. So this sector skills where we just call following things like your maths, English, your ICT, and that. Other sector skills that if you're working as like an apprentice, you're actually following their skills and that. If you're doing practical nursing, then you're going to be doing it, and that's, so you're following those sector skills regulations that have been set by that particular sector.
Okay.
Yeah. So how to answer this? It's quite nice and simple, this one. All you've got to do on here is you need to identify the points that we've gone over. So the reason I put those in, because that is what is required for this answer. You've got to talk about the 5 principles of assessment, where we talked about valid, authentic, current, sufficient, and reliable. So tell me what those mean. What does VAXA mean? What does it stand for? And give me a paragraph on that. Talk about assessment methodology, a paragraph on that. Another paragraph you can mix with your internal and external requirements, put in your quality assurance and your records of assessments. Why is it important to have your assessments recorded? So that you can, things like what you've done from, if you look at students that you've just had joining you now from previous years in school, if they didn't have records from previous assessments, you're starting off blank, aren't you? You don't really know what their skills are or what level of study they're able to. Then you're scrambling for the first few months while you're trying to teach them and assess them. If you've got a good record already in place, you know exactly where they are, and you don't have that wasted time of study in between.
Yeah.
And then obviously refer this back to the sectors that you're working in, because you're in primary, Rex is doing adult education and further education, so just refer it to where you work and tweak it for that. So on to 2.2, use assessment types and methods to enable learners to produce assessment evidence that is valid, reliable, sufficient, authentic, and current. Again, this is, so can you see my screen?
No, it's frozen, I think.
Yes, it says that it should be reconnected now.
Okay, yeah.
If I'm on 2.2, yeah. So when we're looking at assessment types and methods, we do these different types of methods to make sure that we've got a robust system in place where we can produce assessment evidence, and this evidence has to be valid and reliable. So you need to ensure that there's a validity, a reliability, a sufficiency, it's sufficient, authentic, and it creates authenticity and currency. And don't worry about these, because we do go on to cover what these actually mean. So when you have actually got evidence generated, so for this qualification now, once you've finished all of your units, you're going to have an electronic portfolio that's been created for you. So that is the evidence that is going to be judged against the qualification requirements. Now, that gets judged, so unit by unit, that gets judged by myself and the internal quality assurer where I work. So there's two of us that look at it. And then after that's done, sometimes the awarding body, so NCFE, might say, right, I want to have a look at this work as well. They don't always want to, but sometimes they do decide to. And then they'll go back and then they'll actually look at the evidence. So you've got to make sure that you've all got all of that portfolio that you've done as evidence is put in place. So any appendices, any policies and procedures, anything you do that you cover is put all in one portfolio, and that's what you're getting judged against for your assessments. Now, I'm just going to read this little section here. So this should be the agreed opinion of the assessor and the learner of the extent the evidence meets the requirements of the qualification. So what this means is that we'll work together as an assessor and a learner. So you'll work with your students that you're teaching, and you'll work with them to make sure that they are actually meeting those requirements. So sometimes I might ask you to do one particular thing. You might not be able to do that. Then you might say, right, I can't get this policy from here for you, but I can tweak it and I can do something different. And is that possible? Am I okay to do that? And then we can work in accordance with each other and try and make sure that we get the correct piece of information in. And again, because you do electronic portfolios, if you remember when you were doing your teaching assistant studies, Geeta, you said that you used to have a contents page style or a spec sheet where you'd actually cross-reference where you did your work. You didn't have yeah. So that's like an index that you're doing. When we ask you to create a contents page, that's the sort of asking you to do an index. But really your cover sheets that we give back to you, that is the index of where your work is. So it's still covering that qualification and that criteria. And again, the feedback that I put on those covers, it shows that it's showing the competence that you've done, that this requirement has actually been achieved and met.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're judging the evidence, so when you're judging the student's work, you as an assessor, you as a teacher need to ensure these following points. So again, like I said, it's very similar to VAXA, just slightly reordered. So is it authentic? So is it the learner's work, or is it somebody else's work? Is it valid? So, is the evidence that you've given me, is that relevant to the qualification? Is it actually meeting the points that I want you to meet or the qualification wants you to meet? Or is it something to do entirely? If it doesn't, then you get the work sent back to you with feedback saying you need to fix this. Is it reliable? So if we had a couple of different assessors, so if I backed your work, Rex and Geeta, and then I sent it over to another assessor, would they actually come to the same decision as me? Or would they say that, no, we disagree with you and we want you to do, we don't think this meets the criteria? So you've got to work off a certain set of standards to make sure that when you're marking work, another person or another assessor or another teacher would actually come to the same conclusion. So,
hello, Aisha.
Yes, Rex?
Yeah. Are we going to have assignment brief on this, or these learning outcomes are what we're going to write on?
Yes, we've got them here. You've got access to Moodle, haven't you?
Like this one you are teaching now, using assessment type and methods to enable learners to produce assessment results that are valid here. Is this one of the learning outcomes we're going to write on, or there is going to be another assignment brief that we're going to work on?
No, this is going to be for learning outcome 2.2. So you'll be doing these points here to cover 2.2.
So, all right. So this is the one I'm going to write on.
Yes.
All right. Is there any for this learning outcome altogether? Is there any word count?
No, there's no word count for these.
NCFE,
they've not given any word counts on here. They just on a normal basis, I'd expect something like this like the 2.1, I'd expect minimum of 3 paragraphs, nice detailed work in there. For something like 2.2, as long as you're covering each of these points, and you've got, say, a paragraph for your for each point, you'll be okay on that.
All right, it's okay.
But in the little point section, in the tip section, when I go through it, I'll give you an indication of what sort of work needs to be done. If it is, sometimes what happens is when you start writing, you will write reams and reams of work. If it happens that you've answered it, but you've only answered it in 3 or 4 sentences, then I'll send it back and ask you to add more detail. But just work off each answer should be at least around about 3 paragraphs. So about 7 to 8 sentences in each paragraph. So we go on to current. So when you're looking at the evidence, does it show that the learner is meeting the qualification requirements at the time of the assessment? So so if you're coming onto a course now and you say, oh, like if you have both of you decide to go and do the level 5 qualification next, and then you might want to do something called recognized prior learning, where you can get some of these units taken off level 5 because you can do RPL. So would that be current? If that was, say, if this course was done now and 5 years later you decided to go and do the level 5, it might not be current at that time. But if you go and do it in a couple of months or a year or 2 years, it's still current, so you can recognize it as prior learning because it's current work. And then again, sufficient. So does this evidence that you've produced, your assessments, your videos, your portfolios, your tests, your exams, does it actually meet the evidence requirements of the qualification? Are you actually meeting the points and answering them correctly for what they want? So you've got to make sure that you're looking at these points when you're judging your students' work. Now, on a normal basis, when you're there, you're marking English work for UREX, or if you're marking your students' work in primary, you don't really think of all this because you know that they've sat there and you gave them the homework a week ago, or you've given them a task this morning, and an hour later they've worked on it and they've done that task. These will be things that you do automatically without even realizing it. You need to focus on these points a lot more when you're doing, say, the type of course or adult education or further education type of studies where you're assessing portfolios or essays and things within that. So when you're assessing students' work, you need to make sure that all the assessment requirements have been met. So you're looking at quality assurance, make sure that's been done. How to do that? You're going to make sure that your students' learner IDs are checked. You might have an exam environment where students are walking in. You might not know every single person who's in, say, year 11 doing their GCSEs. You need to make sure that the correct person comes in. So check their IDs, check they've done their learner and invigilator declarations. This is not valid for everywhere that you'll be assessing, but I'd say this is more for the further education, high school, university style. You're going to check the compatibility between assessment methods. So are you being fair with them? Are they comparable? Is it in the right format that they need to be in? Check your learner cohorts. So with you, Gita, you might not be that familiar with this, but with you, Rex, you will be, because when you're doing your setting your English exams, you have learner cohorts. So each little section of your students that come in to do their tests, they're getting a set paper, aren't they? So not every student will get the same paper. So you've got to make sure that those 5 or 6 people that you've called in are the correct people for that exam that you've got.
Mm-hmm.
And then also make sure that you've got different assessors are made available. So if I was to come in and do everything for you, Gita, I've got used to you, you've got used to me. We might be quite favourable towards each other, and I might be, automatically be very lenient in certain things. So it's good to have different assessors in so that somebody fresh and new can actually come in and assess your work as well. So are you okay with 2.2?
Yes.
Yeah. So how to answer this? So just again, it's going to be similar to what you've done in 2.1. So if you've already talked about authentic, valid, reliable, current, and sufficient, you refer this small section back to 2.1.
Mm-hmm.
But to start off by describing how assessors judge evidence. So I'd put in a paragraph to say this is how they judge evidence. They make sure it's authentic. What is authentic? What is valid, reliable, current, and sufficient? And then continue on with another paragraph or two and just talk about how quality assurance is done. So quality assurance is done by checking learner IDs, checking that the learner and individuated declarations are done, checking comparability of assessment methods, checking that you've got the correct students for the correct exam, having different assessors, and then to make it a little bit more interesting and to cover yourself completely to show that you understand, you might want to talk about the last assessment you did. And it's okay to base it on the setting that you're in, and then just talk about the last time you did a phonics assessment or math assessment. Leave that. And Rex, you can talk about the last time you did a English assessment, what steps you took, what sort of things you had to do to cover yourself. So on to 2.3. Are you okay to go on to 2.3?
1 second. Like you were saying, if I talk about like last assessment, like which I carried out like a phonics. So in that one, like you're saying about quality insurance or learner like invigilator declarations and all, how shall I relate those points?
So I would start off with that you will have, when you want to do phonics assessments, you're not just doing them willy-nilly, are you? You've got a list of students that you're working off. You'll have a chart. I know when I was in primary system, we used to have a list of names that I had to work through. So you've got that chart. You'll go in and say, for example, randomly, I'd say, oh, I need Sabah Khan today. So I'd go and I'll make sure that I'd say Sabah Khan, and the student will stand up and come to me. But you've got to make sure, have you got the right Sabah Khan? Have you got the right David Williams? Have you got the right student? So you make sure that you've got the right student. So you could say, I know that I've got the right student. They look the correct learner because I know them on a daily basis. If not, you could check their photos of their register. Do you know the system that you get in school where they've got the student photos? So you could check that off there as well.
Okay.
And then to make sure you're doing quality assurance, you're taking them into a separate room. You're sitting in a quiet area. You're making sure that you're doing the same amount of time for each student, and that you're actually only asking the questions, not giving prompts. So just talk about how you make sure that it's all fair, and you're judging it in a nice way so that you're not helping one student more than another. So that will cover your quality assurance as well.
Okay.
That you're keeping the exam conditions or the test conditions exactly the same for each student, regardless of who it is. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yes. So for 2.3, you're going to conduct assessments in line with internal and external requirements. And this one's a little short one, so it's not much on here. So again, when we're doing assessments, there's a lot of methods and processes that we use to actually enhance student learning. So assessments are not always used sitting there with the student and asking them a question or giving them a formal exam or getting them to fill out paperwork, facts and things. It's not always that. Assessment can be done in so many different ways where you're just observing them, you're talking to them, you're just looking at their daily needs. Now, when you're assessing a student, you're just focusing on that individual learner. You're focusing on that class or that group. You're focusing on the people that you're supporting at that time. These assessments that you're doing actually contribute to your ongoing learning. So I could be in class now, and I could, with, say, 10, 15 students, and I might notice that, okay, my lessons are going on for too long, or there seems to be too much talking on my behalf. They're falling asleep, they're getting bored, I'm not getting many responses, and then you might turn around and say, okay, next week I'm going to make sure that it's more interactive so that they can do these things. Or you might have, say, some nursery children where you've asked them to cut out some pictures and then glue them in a particular order. But they might not be able to do that. They might not be able to cut those pictures out. They might be okay with gluing it, but it's taking you, say, almost an hour and a half just to get the students to cut things out. They're getting distracted or they're fighting over glue. So, for the next lesson, you would make sure that their pieces, their little cutouts were pre-cut for them, and that every child had a glue per person, and that you would actually have given them support. So these assessments actually help you to have an insight on how you need to support your students' ongoing learning. What can you do to make sure that they can do a good quality of learning without being jeopardized through certain tasks? So when you're carrying out these assessments, you're looking at internal and external requirements. So again, so between this you get so used to it, you do it on a normal basis anyway. You look at what are your schools, what are the rules and regulations of your schools, what do the rules and regulations say of your curriculum? Are you having to teach certain topics, or if you're doing maths, are you doing number lines, or make sure that you're sticking to that plan that they've given you. So look at those requirements for your school, make sure that you're following them. It's always good to just have a quick look at what their procedures are. If you're not 100% sure, then just get some assistance from your senior leadership team within a school system. We don't normally have assessors or IQA within a primary school or a secondary school, so they're not really that familiar with the terms. So you look at the senior leadership team there. If you're working in further education, you'd get assistance from your assessors or your IQA, which is your internal quality assessor. If they can't help you, then you just get assistance from your EQA, which is the external quality assessor. You pick up the phone and you'd say, right, I'm not 100% sure on how to do this here, or I want to do this. Does this follow your requirements? And I'd phone NCFE and I'd say, right, I want to do this. Is this going to follow what you guys want? Or do I have to adapt it? And they can say yes, or they can say no, or they can advise me on how I can change my techniques. And again, you've got to, we mentioned it quite a few times, but confirming your learner IDs is very important. You need to make sure that if I've got an exam and Geeta comes and sits it for me, I'll probably get like A's or 9s or whatever they are now. You've got to make sure that the right person is doing that test. And then take part in training, involve yourself, other staff, talk to each other. When you come into these type of assessments and judging students' work and judging their evidence, getting knowledge from your colleagues is invaluable, because there'll be people that have been around for years and they'll be able to give you a lot of common sense and even to tweak, like iron things out for you. Are we okay so far?
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, make sure all requirements are met, that you've got contingency in place. So what if a fire alarm goes off? You're sitting down, you're about to do a English exam, and your fire alarm went off. What are you going to do? Everybody has to physically go out of there. So what you do is you write down the time that fire alarm went out. You go out, you line up, and so on, and then you go back. When you come back into the exam environment, you go through all the checks, get your students seated down, and then you write down what time you've come back. And within that, you've got to actually cut that time out and make sure that you still get that hour and a half, but you just add it on instead. So if they only had 10 minutes, they'll still get that 1 hour and 20 minutes left. Or if they only had another 10 minutes left, you know that you've got that 10 minutes remaining. But the reason you would note down what time you had to leave and come back is so that you can prove to the examining body that this is why you went over, and this is the reason here, and this is how long it was.
Okay.
You might have special conditions in place or special circumstances. I remember when I was doing my GCSEs, there was a young girl that studied with me, and in the classroom environment she was fine, but every time she went into an exam, she'd get so anxious she'd pass out because of seeing everybody lined up, seated on the separate little tables in the hall. There were too many people for her. It was too overwhelming. She'd see people writing and she'd be looking around. So it caused every single exam it caused her to pass out. So what they did in the end was they would have her in a private room. She's still got the same exam conditions, but she's not focusing on anyone else. She's not getting anxious, and it seemed to help her. So sometimes you do have to have special conditions. And like we've discussed already, you might want to do an oral instead of a written. You might need extra time, or you might need a scribe. You also need to make sure that you keep records like your feedback, your test results, your assessment results, your portfolios. Like for you, Geeta, I've got all the feedback that I've ever given you. I've got all of your assignments. I've got all of your cover sheets. I've got your SWOT that you gave me. I've got your development plan you gave me. I've got every single appendix that you sent to me, like equality, policy, and so on. All of that is collated in one place. So I've got a good record of all of your work, and I've got that for every student, what is required. So you need to make sure that you keep a good record. And finally, make sure you sign your documents. So if I'm to give you your feedback and I'm going to say that, yeah, you finished, you completed, if I don't sign that off, it's not completed on my assessor side. So I need to make sure that it's signed off. So, on to tips to answer 2.3. So for here, you need to show how assessments can be carried out, talk about the different methods and the variety of assessments that we've gone on about before, and then just go into slides 15 and 16. This will get added onto the PowerPoint to Moodle in a few minutes. And you're just going to go through every single of those points on slides 15 and 16 and just talk about what you need to do, include them in a couple of paragraphs. So on to 2.4. So on here, we're going to record the outcomes of assessments to meet internal and external requirements. Now you see they're quite similar to each other, all of these questions. So again, as we talked about making records, it's really essential that as an assessor, as a teacher, you actually record all of your assessment activity. That even if it's a part test that was done or something that was done 6 months ago, if you're still studying with you, you need to make sure that you're recording that. These records will actually enable your learners to progress, and you'll be able to monitor their process as well. You'll be able to monitor how much they've improved or if there's been any times where they've regressed. And it actually helps you to support your students in a very good way. You'll understand, oh, okay, maybe at Christmas time, the students don't learn that well because they're distracted, or there's familial issues that are going on that might have distracted them. So you're helping them, but also you're covering yourself for internal quality assurance activities as well, because you're monitoring them and you're keeping that record there as well. So you've got to make sure that correct formats are used as well. So when you're doing assessments, make sure you're doing either a written or oral, the assessment route where you're doing all of these portfolios that you're doing, your essays, your assignments, or if you've got a practical route where you make sure you're putting down your observations. You know, whatever it is, make sure that you're using the correct format and recording it correctly. And again, make sure that you've got accurate information. Don't misspell your learners' names. Don't put the wrong student's name down. Don't put the wrong date or the date submitted or the unit identification or the qualification that you're doing. Make sure all of those little bits of information are correct when you're marking them down. So you, again, learner identities, you're recording them. Make sure that you're following the Data Protection Act here as well, so that when you do put down name, date of birth, address, contact number, email address, whatever information that you've got access to, because when I'm marking your work, I don't need to put every single bit of details of you into that assignment. All I've got to do is put your name, your student number, and the unit that you're studying. But as a teacher, you will still have access to a lot of other information. So just make sure that you're following the DPA, Data Protection Act of 2004, and that you're not, leaving your computer screen open, or you're not leaving passing information unnecessarily. So to answer here, I'm going to need to ask you to include an appendix for this as well. But I've got an example of one here. So you need to explain how to record the outcomes of assessment. So how do you make a record of it? How are you following the internal and external quality arrangements? And then also make sure you put down in that section there for internal and external quality arrangements that you're using the correct formats for the assessments. That if they're telling you that if the awarding body says that a PowerPoint needs to be made and a written report needs to be done for this unit that you're studying, you need to make sure that that is what the student produces. Or if it says make a leaflet, make sure that is what you've got. If it's an exam, if it's a test, what sort of format is it? Make sure you're doing the correct ones. And again, make sure the information is accurate for the student's personal details. Like I mentioned, you do need to include an appendix to support your support the answer here, because it's actually asking you to record. So that will show that you know how to record things. So if you can get hold of a progress report, so if you speak to your management, one of the senior management team or a key stage leader, I'm not sure if it's called the same thing everywhere, but you get something called an ITRAP primary, where you actually get a list of all the years and all the assessment results, what the attainment are, they attaining above or below, and I've got an example of a picture here. So something like this, where it's showing what years there are, what their attainment progress levels are, what percentages there are, what the boys are doing, what the girls are doing, what the overall total is for that year. So they're just called a yearly progress reports in school.
So do I need to get for any particular child or as in just general?
Just a general one is fine. And they don't have names on them, so they won't mind sharing it with you. It's personal details that they do mind sharing, but things like this, they won't mind sharing it.
Okay.
And Rex, you should be able to get hold of something similar as well through work on this here.
Okay.
So on to the last one. So 2.5 is to communicate assessment information to other professionals with an interest in learner achievement. So when you're giving assessment information to other professionals, so other staff members, it might be your fellow teaching assistants, it might be your teachers, it might be administration staff, your senior leadership team. It might even be a specialist that's coming to your school and is assisting a particular student with behavior management. You need to pass on information, you need to give them data so that they can work in a, in a positive and a good manner way. So when you're communicating data, you're going to do this in a variety of ways. You might do it via emails, you might have a meeting, then with that meeting, you might have minutes of meetings after that. Are you both aware of what minutes of meetings are?
Important points which are being discussed in the meeting?
Yes. So it's just like a document where it says who's attended, where they were, what the topic was, and then with the points that were done and any action points for the future. Yeah. Sometimes you might even need to give a screenshots of their assessment test, or if a student did really well in a spelling test and you just want to share it with your colleagues and say, see how much William has progressed. Did you see how Rebecca, she didn't know how to spell these things first, and now she's done amazingly. She got 10 out of 10. So you might even want to just show them, not on an official basis, but on an unofficial basis, and share their successes. And, so it can be done on an official basis where you're sharing official data, or sometimes you just want to celebrate your students and you want to share information in that way as well. So overall, when you're giving assessment information to all of those professionals that I talked to you about, you need to make sure that you've got accuracy information, so the information is correct. You're talking about the correct person, that you're being confidential. You've got a legitimacy of interest. So if you come and you start telling me something about one of your students, there's no legitimacy there. I don't need to know too much information about them besides the basic common. If you're just telling me a story, that's something different. If you're giving me a whole lot of different information, what the test results were, what they did here and there, you have to make sure you're giving it to the correct person that they've got a need to know. Make sure there's a promptness of communication as well, because this is an important one. So if your student did an assessment today and I email you and say, right, I need to know what the assessment results were for these students here, and you wait 2 weeks to give me the information, the time frame has gone. What am I going to do after that with that information? I might have already collated different bits, or what I wanted that information for might have passed now. So make sure you do it as soon as possible. And again, make sure you're doing it in the agreed format. How are you sharing the information? If someone's asking you to do an email and you decide to pick up the phone and talk to them about it, it's not the format that's been agreed. It might be nice to discuss it verbally, but if they've asked you to do it on an email, you've discussed it verbally, back it up with an email as well, so that you're covering yourself there. So are we okay with what we've talked about so far? Brilliant. So for answering 2.5, you just need to start off with addressing which professionals you share information with. So who is it? Who are you talking to? So just talk about senior leadership, administration staff. You might have truancy staff, officers that come in. You might have other professionals like special physiotherapists, behavior management, teachers, teaching assistants, learning support assistants. Even sometimes during lunchtime, you might need to share information with the lunch staff as well. So there's a few things that you need to just put them all in. So talk about who you're sharing it with, so like the rest of the department, so that they can collate key stage results. Talk about who it is and why you're doing it. So things like why they're doing it, so they can get key stage results, end of year results. They can adapt work, they can make implementations, do interventions, they can get specialists in to support their students, so a whole load of reasons. And then I want you to continue on and include information on how this data that you're passing on can be shared. So things like meetings or emails, and then also including it how you make sure that you're being confidential, how you're following identity, and so on. So just go back to the previous slide here. So just make sure you do follow accuracy information, put down that you're covering the identity of the learners, that you're doing the correct learner, you're being confidential, only sharing it with people who need to know and who actually have a reason to know, and that you're doing it in a timely manner. So I'm going to